Would you like to play some football?
Hey, welcome to another edition of Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast. My name's George Schroeder.
And I'm Brad Edwards, and it was a fun week of college football. We had a couple of really big games in the SEC, and as a result of one of them, we have a new number one in college football, and we're going to get into all that and a lot more.
Not in the SEC.
No, it's not in the SEC, but we're going to get into that with our friend Chris Lowe of ESPN, who also a friend of the pod, joined us last year. Looking forward to talking to him again.
Yeah, Chris, thanks for joining us, man. How are you doing?
I'm great. Good to be with you guys again, and it's always and Brad knows this, having been the BCS guru back in the day. When you start to get closer to November, strange things start to happen.
Yep.
In college football, and I think we're in store for a few more strange things over the next 2, 3, 4 weeks.
So, Chris, I know you were on Rocky Top, and I want to talk about that. And you made your way through the cigar smoke in here to talk with us today. But I want to start with Georgia, Texas, because what a tremendous showing by the Bulldogs, who kind of said, "Hey, we're back. We didn't go anywhere." It reminds me a little bit of when we used to leave Alabama for dead back in the day, and then they would just go pace somebody. They rolled into Austin. The Longhorns feeling really good about themselves. And 30-15 was the final, but Georgia really kind of put it not quite out of reach, but really put their stamp on it early. You had a chance to take a look at that, even though you were covering another game on Rocky Top.
Oh, absolutely! I got to see a lot of that game. To me, that was vintage Kirby Smart. I mean, he's 6-1 in top 5 matchups since he's been at Georgia, and that's not by mistake. He does his best work in these situations, and nobody's better at motivating their team, whether it's real motivation, fake motivation, bulletin board material, than Kirby Smart. And we've seen it over and over and over again. And what's the old cliche? He had Texas right where he wanted it.
Nobody believes in us, he said, because of the guys on game day who picked Texas.
Nobody believes in the Dogs.
Nobody believes in Georgia.
Nobody's recruited better than Georgia, developed players better than Georgia. And yet nobody, I mean, of course, I'm being facetious. But no, I thought, to me, this all started back when I was in Tuscaloosa back in September, when Georgia picked itself up off the ground at halftime. They were just getting embarrassed, 28-0. Came back and showed a lot of pride and went ahead in that game. Ryan Williams makes the great play and Alabama wins. You really could sort of tell that this Georgia team still had what it took, and they were going to be heard from again. I actually picked Georgia. I thought they would go up there and win. And so I'm not surprised. I guess I'm a little surprised that they dominated that game, the first part of the game, the way they did. But let's not forget, as I said a minute ago, I mean, who else in the country has recruited better and developed players better and stockpiled depth more than Georgia? They're still Georgia, and they got a few warts. But I think, you start talking about the top 40 players, guys, on a roster, I'm not sure anybody's more talented than Georgia when it comes to their top 40.
Yeah, we forget that they were sort of Alabama 2.0 in a lot of ways.
Yeah, Chris, what does this do to your perception of Texas? And normally, I mean, it's no big deal to lose a game to Georgia, and especially with a 12-team playoff where it's not doing anything to crush your playoff hopes. But at the same time, this was a Texas team that really had not been tested largely because of its schedule. They hadn't really played anybody. Michigan, we can tell at this point in the season, is not very good. So by far the best team they've played, really handled them pretty easily. What does that do to your perception of at home? And so as far as the likelihood of a Georgia-Texas rematch for the SEC title?
And you're dead on, Brad. And I think a lot of people said that, even looking at Texas a few weeks ago, that the schedule makers were sort of kind to Texas this year when you looked at their schedule within the league. I mean, go back and look at Oklahoma's schedule versus Texas' schedule in the league. There's no compare. I'm talking about the two new teams, obviously. Texas had a lot more manageable path. And I think now, as you go forward after getting spanked like that at home, there's going to be more questions. I mean, remember, they play at A&M to end the season. That game's in College Station. And I would dare say that game is going to play a huge role and how many teams in the SEC, and maybe who makes the playoff. The Horns haven't dropped that game at home to Georgia. I know some people will probably chuckle when I say this, but they got to go to Vanderbilt this weekend, and Vanderbilt's been a tough out for everybody they play.
I chuckled, by the way,
Brad
but yes,
Well,
I understand it. I get it.
You're coming off a tough loss. I'm sure that's a kick in the gut to lose like that at home when you've been pretty dominant. Now you got to go play a team that's I don't think Vanderbilt will be intimidated. I really don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting for sure. And I'm glad you mentioned Texas A&M. I don't really want to get deep into the weeds here on this stuff, but we sort of wrote Texas A&M off after the first game of the year, Notre Dame, and then those guys, all they've done is looked pretty good. And it doesn't even matter if they're not very good. When they get Texas at home, especially for the first time in however many years it's been since they left the Big 12, it's going to be a crazy, crazy scene and a crazy difficult game for Texas. And so if A&M's as good as I think they might be, you're right. That could be a tremendous game to fast forward to down the season.
Yeah.
I'd like to have about 8 tickets for that game on the 50. We'd all go to Hawaii for a week. And
there's no
have a
question.
big time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the good news is we've got people here who've got tickets. The bad news is they don't want to give them to me for that game.
Right.
Real quick on Georgia, Texas, because we could get deep into it for a lot. I've read the explanations and everything else, but the pass interference call reversal that happened after a lengthy delay and a long huddle by the officials that appeared to be happening in part, the delay at least, because of the Texas student section was throwing stuff onto the field, which is right. The moral of the story is if you don't like what the officials called, throw stuff on the field and they'll change it. But that reversal of that pass interference, thoughts on that? I mean, we've all seen an awful lot of football. You almost never see a judgment call like pass interference reversed, period. But if it does, it's a huddle in the first 15, 20 seconds. This is like 3 or 4 minutes later, and they reconvened and had another meeting. It's like a regularly scheduled meeting or something, and changed the call. And I think it was the right thing to do because I didn't think it was pass interference. But it's a weird look. And obviously it was a really bad look for the Texas students to be throwing stuff on the field. So don't get me wrong. Thoughts on that? I mean, what actually happened? I know what the SEC said, but I'd be interested if an eye in the sky or an ear in the sky got in their ears and said, y'all, that's not a good call or not.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's what Kirby Smart and Josh Brooks and everybody at Georgia was wondering. I think Kirby's right. The precedent is what's dangerous here. So going forward, if there's a bang call like that and maybe they got it wrong and there's some type of disruption in the game to give the officials more time to think about it, talk about it, when did the guy that said he made the wrong call or erred, when did he decide that? Did he decide that right away? Did he decide that during the 3 or 4 minutes they were trying to sort things out while while knuckleheads were throwing stuff on the field? I don't know. But I think a lot of coaches probably wonder now, well, what happens going forward if there's a play similar to that and there's some type of stoppage, whether you're throwing bottles on the field or what have you on the field? That's, I think, what angered Kirby Smart so much. And you go back and look at some of the statements, guys. The George J.D. statement was pretty strongly worded.
Yeah.
And certainly Kirby didn't hold back. I know you have a hard time believing Kirby didn't hold back. But that's was the call right? Yeah, probably so at the end of the day. But I think the way they went about it and the fact that there was something that had nothing to do with the football game, stopped the game and gave them more time to talk about it, is what all coaches are probably concerned about.
You called it a bang play. It's a bang play. It's easy to get it wrong in the heat of the moment. And it's a judgment call, right? So for me to say it was wrong, I'm just saying it looked wrong. But if it's a bang play like that, it needs to be bang for you to reverse it.
Right. And you shouldn't have extra time to sit around and talk about it. And you're right. They went back and talked about it. They had that second huddle or whatever you want to call it, confirmed. And that's, coaches just want consistency. They don't want anything like that. Fans too. We all do. The media. They don't want something like that. Again, that has nothing. That's not a part of the game. There's a stoppage that even if it gives the appearance of it all, the optics of it all, make it look like that had something to do with the reversal of the call. is a bad look, period.
So, Chris, because of the Texas loss, Oregon moves up to number 1. Before we move on from this game, you have any issue with Oregon being the number 1 team? We know it's meaningless. All that matters is what the selection committee does at the end. But I can't say that I wasn't expecting Oregon to be number 1 at any point this season because I thought they were good enough to have a chance to be there. But I can tell you that a few weeks ago, I was not expecting to see them there, and it's all happened pretty fast.
Well, they had a couple of at least one game where they weren't, they didn't pass the eye test.
First 2, really.
Yeah, really. Well, they
but certainly
didn't.
Boise State would be one of those.
And that's right, George. I'm glad you brought that up because now all of a sudden Boise State's a pretty quality win.
Yeah.
And I know
but
they're not.
They had to win it on the last-second field goal, right? I mean, you shouldn't have to do that at home if you're a number 1 team. So
no, but if Boise continues to win and wins its conference, Boise's going to be a top 15 team probably in the committee rankings. Ohio State's obviously I'd say one of the best 3 wins period to this point in college football.
Right. Yep.
Georgia's win over Texas was big.
Alabama's win over Georgia.
Alabama's win over Georgia, and then Oregon winning. But hey, go get a quarterback. You get the right quarterback. It's a quarterback world more than ever. You guys know that. They go get Dylan Gabriel. He was lights out against Ohio State. Oregon, like a lot of teams, Texas, Ohio State, Tennessee, Ole Miss, have spent a lot of money in NIL to go get guys and to bring guys in, like a Dylan Gabriel. You're seeing that pay off for them. I want to see how they weather the rest of the Big Ten schedule. But I'm like you, Brad. I thought Oregon would be a pretty good football team. And I would have, if you would have said, who are 6 or 7 teams, or just say 5 or 6 teams that you're most certain will make the playoff, Oregon probably would have been one of those.
Yeah. All right, well,
No
let's switch gears here, and we'll get into the game where you were, which is Alabama at Tennessee. I got to say, if not for the rivalry aspect and the fact that you had 2 highly ranked teams already with a loss, creating this sense of urgency around the game, it aside from that, it was not all that compelling because, man, was it sloppy. There were a lot of penalties. Both quarterbacks failed to make a lot of plays that should have been made, a lot of missed passes that could have been long touchdowns, other big plays. But when it came down to it, the quarterback that made the plays was the Tennessee quarterback. George just calls him Nico because he doesn't want to attempt to say the last name. But
Nico,
he made a couple.
Maliava.
He made.
Yes, that's not in my contract to have to pronounce that anymore. So
he made finally 2 good throws that ended up with even better catches. One to set up a short touchdown, the other one the actual game-winning touchdown it turned out to be. What does that do? We've watched Tennessee's offense struggle 3 games in a row, shut out in the first half. Do those big plays toward the end, do you think, is that something that you expect them to build on, or is Tennessee just going to be a team that's winning with defense the rest of the way? What's your take on that?
First off, you're being kind, it was a very sloppy game, ragged game. Alabama with the season high 15 penalties. Tennessee manages to overcome 3 first-half turnovers. Rarely do you do that and win in an SEC game against an upper-tier team. I don't know, Brad. I mean, I think Josh Heupel's asking himself the same question. Is this just who we are on offense? And are we going to be hit and miss? Now, I think the good news for Tennessee is Iamaleava, not just Nico, but Iamaleava, George, did hit some long plays down the field in the second half. They had not done that the last few weeks. And he missed some throws in the first half he should have made. But they finally hit some big plays down the field. Does that give them confidence? This is a big open week for Tennessee. They got some guys banged up. I think Nico took a pretty good shot in that game. I don't know how healthy he would be going into a game this weekend. They're off. I think that's good for Tennessee. But they listen, they've got to get a lot more consistent offensively. You can't, as you get deeper into the season and play better teams, and it's not just, to me, it's not just about getting to the playoff. Do you get there? Do you have the firepower to make a run in the playoff?
Right.
And they've got to be better and more consistent in their deep passing game and not have those lulls in the first half. I mean, they go to Georgia, I think the second or third week of November. You go to Georgia and don't score in the first half, you're going to get run out of the place, and
Yeah,
they know that. But let me say this for Tim
yep.
Banks and that defense. His defense has played exceptionally well. They haven't given up more than 19 points in any game this year. I looked this up today. They forced more turnovers, 11, than they've given up touchdowns in 7 games. That's a winning formula on defense.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's the thing, right? We thought they were going to have this fantastic whiz bang Josh Heupel offense, and they did when they were playing sort of the paper mache teams at the beginning of the year. But it certainly, as they played better defenses, it slowed way down. And Nico has looked like a freshman sometimes, clearly super talented, but their defense is a constant. And frankly, the front is elite, fun to watch, unless you're an offensive coordinator or a quarterback, right? But that to me takes them a long way. But you're right. In today's college football game, man, you've got to be able to score some, because eventually somebody can wear your defense out. That's
Yep.
just what happens, right?
Yeah, it's a different era. I mean, Brad remembers that, Nick's first championship in 2009. Now Tennessee doesn't have Julio Jones, but that was a team that won on defense. They ran the ball, possessed the ball, made big plays on defense, and then threw the ball down the field just enough to Julio to win games. And that's sort of Dylan Sampson is a terrific running back for Tennessee. But I don't think in this day and age, having to play potentially, 16 or 17 games to win a national title, you can continue to win that way. You've
Right.
got to be able to be more explosive on offense.
Let me go the other locker room, the visitor locker room that had cigar smoke for all those years, and then they didn't have it 2 of the last 3. What are we to make of Alabama this year? I know what Feinbaum's going to make of them all week long. I understand, and I don't mean him; I mean his callers. But
right,
what are we to make of Alabama and Kalen DeBoer, and Nick's out there living it up and doing a great job on game day? Alabama fans don't know quite what to do. My question is, what do you make of them?
Well, let's see. What are we, about 24 hours since that game ended?
Yeah,
Nice
Sunday
to
night
see.
we record this. Yeah,
It's nice to see that the Bama fans are taking it very well to this point.
as they do.
Some of the messages and texts I've gotten, it's like, but I'm not surprised. I don't even think any of the new regime is completely surprised. I think Kalen DeBoer knew what he was walking into. Now, they've not been very good, nor have they been very disciplined. They made a lot of dumb plays, dumb penalties, and mistakes. Milroe, I give Milroe a ton of credit. He's the reason that team transformed last year the way they did. He got better and better. But he's made, 5 or 6 turnovers in the last 3 games, and he has not played winning football, the last couple of weeks. He's got to play a lot better, smarter. He can't throw the ball to the other team. He can't turn it over. Brad, you've seen Alabama for a long time. Really, outside of Ryan Williams on offense, who else scares you on that side of the ball?
And I think that's the big thing, Chris. Let's go back to the play that Ryan Williams made on an underthrown ball that ended up winning the game against Georgia. If not for that play, think where we would be right now with Alabama, because they would have lost 3 of their last 4 at this point. We wouldn't be talking about playoff as even a possibility. As it stands now, they basically have 2 games coming up. The last 3 games on their schedule are Oklahoma, I think it's Mercer, and Auburn, which is in the Auburn game's in Tuscaloosa. Even as bad as they've played, they should win those 3. They've got Missouri coming up in Tuscaloosa and then a trip to LSU. If they can win both of those games, they should finish 10-2, and I think 10-2's got a really good chance of getting them in the playoff. But as you mentioned just a little while ago about Tennessee, the standard is, especially for these upper echelon SEC teams, it's not, okay, are you good enough to get in? It's like with the basketball tournament. Are you good enough to get into the tournament? No, it's like, can you make a run? And I'm looking at Alabama right now, and aside from 1 half of play against Georgia, I have seen nothing to lead me to believe that they are capable of stringing together 3 top 10 wins in a row to have a chance to come home with a national championship. Sure, they could beat anyone on a given day. We've already seen that. But could they even string 2 of those games together? There's just such a lack of consistency because of what you said, the sloppiness, that I have a hard time taking them seriously. And look, maybe if they go into Baton Rouge and win, people start to change the way they think about them. But as we sit here right now, man, this team is not a threat to win a national championship, and they're barely a team that you can continue to talk about in the same sentence as playoff.
No, they have not played. They've not played like a playoff team. I think is probably the simplest way to say it. They just haven't. And you look at and yeah, they've had a hard schedule. You know, Wisconsin's not great, but they did have to play at Wisconsin. They had to play Georgia at home. They had to play at Tennessee. But I don't think they can get through. I don't think they can get through unscathed the rest of the way. Not the way they're playing. And you wonder where they are emotionally. The kids on that team haven't really experienced this type of, adversity. This is the first time they've lost 2 conference games before November since the year before Nick came there, in 06. This is a totally uncharted water for that program. Now, all that said, I agree, Brad, that if they somehow get to 10-2, they will be in the playoff because that win over Georgia will count 2 or 3 times. Plus, that gives them a win. Hypothetically would give them a win over LSU and Missouri. I don't see it in them. You look at teams like right now. You guys mentioned A&M and LSU. I probably was guilty the first week of the season because both those teams lost to non-conference teams. USC not very good at all. LSU lost to. Now Notre Dame, I guess we'll find out. A&M lost to them in the first game. I didn't cast them aside, but I thought, are they really playoff teams? Well, they both have played a lot better and play this weekend. They're the only 2 unbeaten teams in the conference.
Isn't that
conference
crazy?
Games. So
the 2 teams nobody's been talking about for the last 5 weeks are the last 2 unbeatens in conference play. Well, go figure.
So it's a long-winded way for me to say this. I think there's going to be a 2-loss team or 2 in the SEC that gets squeezed in the playoff race because I think there's going to be some more carnage coming. I haven't seen enough from Alabama to make me to believe they're going to be one of those teams in the mix. Missouri's another one. Missouri has not played very well. They've squeaked by, and yet they're one of those 6-1 teams right now, but their schedule is probably as manageable as anybody's.
Well, but the question is going to be there is sort of how does a committee look at those wildly varying schedule strengths, even inside a league, right? How does that work? Whether, let's say Missouri finishes 10-2 and somebody else finishes 9-3, and I don't know that we can go there or whatever, or if 2 of them finish 10-2, right? One of them had a much tougher schedule. That's what we're about to find out with Missouri. I don't know.
You got to have some wins over the committee's final top 25. That's the key. And we don't know what that final top. I told a friend of mine tonight, a big Tennessee fan. I said, I know as much as this pains you, you better root for Alabama to win. You don't want Alabama to roll in at 8-4,
right?
And you don't beat Georgia, and Tennessee sitting there at 10-2. The Oklahoma win's not going to be worth anything.
Nope.
So you won't have, if you're Tennessee in that scenario, you're not going to have any key wins. You're not going to have any marquee wins.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So those are the types of things, George, I think you're talking about that we don't really know right now how it's all going to shake out. But I do think there are going to be a few more things in the league, maybe some teams losing that we don't see losing. And I think it's sort of going to all bunch up. And I wouldn't be shocked to see everybody, maybe one team gets through with just 1 loss. But I bet you most of your teams that we're talking about that are 6-1 will have at least 2 losses.
Yeah. So, Chris, give me your thoughts on this because you just mentioned one thing that I was going to say, but we kind of covered it, which is that the way everything's setting up this year, I don't think there's going to be a 9-3 team in this year's playoff. I think it probably will happen at some point in this expanded playoff, but this is not going to be the year for it because there's just going to be too many teams across the 4 major conferences coming in at 11-1 or 10-2 going into that championship weekend. What is your take on the depth of the actual contenders? We've talked about it a couple of times. It's one thing to get into. It's another thing to have a chance to win. As we sit here right now, how many teams do you think, and I guess name them, do you think are good enough to actually win this thing?
I'm going to go old school here, guys, and say the teams with the best quarterback and the best defensive line. So Georgia, Oregon, probably Texas would be the 3 that jump out. Ohio State is talented across the board, but I don't think they're as good at quarterback as those other three schools. But I would say, again, in no order, Oregon, Texas, Georgia. I would not certainly rule out Ohio State. In the SEC, I don't know other than Texas and Georgia. I've not seen enough from Tennessee. Ole Miss is another team that, I mean, they haven't beaten anybody.
Right.
They got all their mileage on beating up on cupcakes. Now, I think they're good. I think they're good in their defensive front. But to this point, you don't win a 100-meter race, the 60-meter mark. But outside of Texas and Georgia right now, I don't see it. I think when you look at the ACC, now Miami has been pretty strong. I saw A&M in Florida, but I know A&M is a team that we talked about a little bit ago. I like how physical and tough they are. Getting Wegman back, I think, helps them a little bit. But I don't see just a wide array of teams right now that I would point to. I don't. It's hard for me to see anybody in the Big 12 that you say is this team's going to go deep. Maybe Miami. I wouldn't completely rule Clemson out. I think Clemson's a team that is probably. I'd be shocked if they're not in the ACC championship game. And let's say they went out and they beat Miami in the ACC championship game. They're going to get a top seed, a bye, probably the third seed.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they get a pretty good bracket setting up for Dabo Sweeney and crew.
Well, and that's key too. We're not even there yet, right? So, but a bye, which means one less game to get beat up, but also one fewer game that you have to get up for against better and better opponents is a big deal. I don't think we quite understand how important winning one of those 4 conference titles is going to be at this point. So,
George,
do
you have one to add to that? My 4, by the way, Chris, are the same 4 that you just said. I had the Oregon and Ohio State in the Big Ten, and then Georgia and Texas in the SEC are the only 4 that right now I see as being good enough to win 3 straight games over that quality of competition. George, do you have one to add?
I mean, Vanderbilt, of course, but other than that,
well, I mean,
sorry, I'm just trying to get y'all to chuckle.
The Fighting Clark Lees. Now, the other thing I was going to say is, think about the SEC going back to the Texas-Georgia thing. What if those two meet in the championship game, SEC championship game? Now, think about this. The loser of that game has got to turn and play, 10 days later, 2 weeks later?
Yep.
And would have to win 17 games to win a national title. That's hard. I mean,
yeah.
And I do think those are 2 of the best 4 teams right now. But if those 2 teams do indeed meet in the SEC title game, to win that many games after you're playing that many games in that short of time, that's a tough ask.
Yeah.
Well, we could see the same thing with Oregon, Ohio State too, right? In the Big Ten, essentially the same thing. You're right, and this is all new scenarios for us. We've said this over and over and again about everything. Everything's a new scenario for us to think through. It's almost better in some ways well, I don't know. It just kind of depends, I guess. But in some ways, maybe it's better not to make your conference title if you're going to get in conference championship game. If you're going to get
you're
in,
not going to win it. Yeah.
Right. So
Penn State, look, in your Big Ten scenario, let's say Penn State doesn't get in the title game, but they're solidly in the playoff. They got an extra week now. Grant, they're not going to have a bye, but they're not going to be playing in that championship game and have to turn around and play. I think it's 2 weeks later. So the championship game is the 8th. The conference championship games are the 8th. Is it a week later? It's pretty short turnaround. It's a short turnaround.
Yeah.
I know.
So, there are all sorts of rabbit holes we could go down as far as like the seeding and how this is going to work. But I guess we got to get this wrapped up. But Chris, thank you so much for joining us. And it was a big weekend in the SEC, and we appreciate your perspective on that, and look forward to talking to you down the road. Chris Lowe from ESPN.
You bet, guys. Good to be with you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Chris Lowe, ESPN, friend of the pod, and was on. Go back and check out his appearance with us last year. We talked about faith with him, and it was great to hear his story too. So Brad, one of the questions that I think that's still sitting out there for us is, a bigger picture. We start talking about stuff like that. One of the schools we would have thought would have been in the playoff earlier this year. I just want to bring this up because I know that you talked about it with me in our extensive pre-show production meeting. Is Lincoln Riley in any trouble? Because one of the more really surprising, goofy things about the entire season so far has been the fact that USC has really fallen off the map. I mean, just keeps losing games.
And after, I mean, Chris referenced it, after beating LSU in the season opener, that was a huge win.
Mm-hmm.
Then you get into conference play. And look, I think if you had said before the season that they were going to lose at Michigan, or even if they lost at home to Penn State, nobody would have thought that was atrocious. But we didn't see the losses to Minnesota and Maryland coming. And now they're sitting there at 1-4 in the Big Ten. I don't care what your expectations were. If you're a USC fan, how much you might have tempered them.
Yeah.
It wasn't that. Exactly.
Right.
And so this is worse than they could have imagined that it would have gone. And look, we remember with Lincoln Riley when Oklahoma, remember he made the move to USC when the talks were starting about Oklahoma possibly going to the SEC.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody's like, oh, he's trying to dodge competition. And then, of course, USC goes to the Big Ten. And it's like, well, at least it won't be as tough as the SEC would have been. Well, I mean, it's tough enough. That's because, I mean, if you're losing to Minnesota and Maryland, I mean, I guess that's the equivalent of in the SEC, you're losing to Kentucky and Arkansas, or maybe it's worse than that. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, so the thing is, George, we don't know what the situation is inside that athletic department. They're obviously, you've covered this stuff much more than I have as far as the reporting on coaching maneuvers and what goes into buyouts, what relationships are between not only ADs and coaches, but other people in the university administration and the coaches. So it's a multi-layered thing, and it's easy to say this guy's in trouble. Most of the time, he's probably not. But
yeah,
there's no question. This is alarming. This is alarming for sure.
I wouldn't say he's in trouble, but keep in mind what he rolled into this year after last year. There was like not heat, but it was just like, this has got to get fixed. And everybody was like, okay, it's going to get fixed. And now all of a sudden it's not.
Well, he had 3 years of Caleb Williams, one at Oklahoma and two at USC,
right.
And didn't win a conference championship with him.
Right.
With Caleb
Williams.
Go
to the playoff, much less, I mean, a transcendent type, and I really mean that. I don't use that lightly, quarterback at the college level anyway. And you're right, didn't get it done, and everybody thought he would. And if the problem was defense, now the problem is both. Now the problem they've got is both sides of the ball.
The defense has not been terrible.
No, but
the offense has underperformed.
Let's put it this way: they're never going to. He may prove me wrong, but he hadn't yet. They're never going to have a defense. They're not going to roll out a defense like we were talking about Tennessee has.
Right.
To where when Tennessee's offense is struggling, the defense can pull them through a lot of the time. They're not going to roll that out. So Lincoln's calling card is his offense is going to score and score and score again. The quarterback's going to be tremendous. And I'm not here to take shots at Miller Moss, but their offense has not been what we're expecting out of him. So it's not working. And we're in a new world of college football. I get that. So maybe somebody could say there's some heat around him. It just seems crazy to think about. But this is year 3.
3, yeah.
At USC, I had to think through that. I would just tell you this. They finished, if they run the table, then he's, whatever. But if this thing sort of falls off a cliff, it's not completely out of the question.
They have Notre Dame at the end of the schedule. So I don't know off the top of my head who else they have left in conference play that's potentially a loss. I think they miss both Ohio State and Oregon. I could be wrong, but
no, I think that's right. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and that's the other thing. It's like if by all accounts they got a friendly draw on the conference schedule, and they've already lost 4 games. So like we said, obviously not what USC was looking for, but I think it's got to be more than 1 year in the Big Ten before you do something as drastic as make a coaching change. Not to mention, I don't know what their situation is as far as their NIL and the resources they have. I would think they've got pretty good resources, but you can go out there and do a pretty considerable roster overhaul in one offseason, as we've seen in many other cases. So, who they would go after, what are their biggest needs? Like you said, they need a lot, but definitely surprising.
Lost 3 in a row. Let me give you their remaining schedule. Ready? This week, Rutgers at home in LA at the Coliseum. November 2nd at Washington in Seattle. Then they have an off week. November 16th, Nebraska in LA. November 3rd, they're at UCLA, but it's the color game, the color wash game or whatever they call it in Pasadena. And then November 30th, as you said, they finished the season at home against Notre Dame. So, you'd say, okay,
I'm thinking 6-6, right?
You'd say, well, the majority that, you would have said, oh yeah, they're okay. Notre Dame's a tough one, but based on all these others, but look at what they just did. So yeah, no, let me put this way. Y'all put a pin in that. Probably nothing's going to happen, but put a pin in it and just wait and see. Right. So
Yep.
That's the way I look at it, is just sort of, that's got to be in the back of your mind. This isn't working. So do they, and again, I would say one other thing. Has anybody's star sort of fallen from where it was to kind of like, at best you would say meh than Lincoln's over the last couple of years? I don't think so. I mean, because he was like top echelon. This guy's a top 5 coach, everything else. And it's because of what they did at Oklahoma. And had they had a defense, they probably won a national title, maybe 2. I mean, who knows, right? But they didn't have a defense. But because of what they did at Oklahoma, kept going to the playoff and had these crazy good offenses, Heisman winners and everything else. But now all of a sudden he goes to USC and he thinks it's going to like be better than Oklahoma, and instead it's been way worse. So, all right, big games this week, Brad. Let's go to big games because we can keep talking about that forever.
We'll run through these, and I mean, some of them are just being mentioned for the sake of the rankings, but
air quotes big games on some of them. But
big
hey,
games,
it's college football. We love it.
So 2 right off the bat: Notre Dame and Navy in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Navy's ranked. Navy's undefeated.
I love that it's a big game.
Yeah, it is. It is. I don't know. I don't know how much Notre Dame's going to be favored by. I would assume it's going to be more than 2 touchdowns. This would be a huge upset, despite Navy being ranked. Hey, look, Notre Dame lost to Northern Illinois, so I guess it's possible. Illinois at Oregon is another one. Illinois, much improved team. I like Illinois in general. If this game was at Illinois, I would be far more interested.
In general?
What'd you say?
Oh, you mean the football program, not the state?
The football program,
yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm a bigger fan of the football program.
No, I love Brett Bielema. I'm just messing around.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
I mean, they were a pathetic team just a few years ago. So to see them not only getting into the top 25, but hanging around for a few weeks, I mean, great for them. But I think this is a big loss coming. Missouri at Alabama. This is kind of like a survival game. You look at both teams. Alabama certainly can't afford to take a 3rd loss and still be in this thing. Missouri, even though they only have 1 loss, if they don't beat Alabama, they could win the rest of them. They'd be 10-2 without a real quality win. I mean, the Vanderbilt win in overtime might end up being their best win, and that's not going to get you into the playoff. So a big game for both of those teams. Somebody's probably going to get knocked out.
No, I think that's important that I'm glad you said that, because you're right. I don't think this is year, and you mentioned that earlier, that a 9-3 team gets in, even named Alabama. So every game from here on out is survival for Alabama, but certainly this one.
Yeah.
Missouri hasn't looked good, as Chris Lowe said. They could have, would have, should have already been knocked out, so to speak. I don't think they're getting in at 10-2. And by the way, I'm not convinced they'd finish 10-2, but I think they've got to run the table basically at this point. Yeah. They've lost their margin for error because of the fact that their schedule ended up being the super light schedule. So elimination game almost. We can't quite say it that, but you would definitely be on needing all sorts of help from all sorts of people. And I think that's true even of a 2-loss Missouri coming out of the game, but certainly of a 3-loss Alabama.
And, another game, ranked versus ranked. Think of it what you will. We've mentioned it earlier in the podcast. Texas at Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt, ladies and gentlemen, is ranked this week number 25. So, Texas bounced back. I think Chris Lowe referenced it earlier. We'll see how Texas handles that, de-pantsing at the hands of Georgia, and whether they kind of fall asleep in Nashville the way that sometimes teams are prone to do. But Vandy playing really well, and we'll see if they can give Texas a game.
One of the things to pay attention to going forward too is, he brought Quinn Ewers back in, Sarkisian did. But he brought in Arch Manning at the end of the first half, and there were big, cheers and everything else. Now, Quinn Ewers is the better quarterback still, but it's something to pay attention to going forward. Just as we move forward in the season, if Quinn Ewers can't get it done, he may not be all the way back from that oblique injury, as far, but if he can't get it done, they've already shown they'd go to Arch Manning, and we'll see what happens with that. So
Yeah.
you did have one more, right?
Yeah,
LSU at Texas
LSU
A&M.
at Texas A&M is probably the biggest game of the day. As we said a little while ago, the last two
Just as
SEC
we all
teams that are
expected after week
undefeated.
one.
Yeah, exactly what we all thought. These would be the last two undefeated SEC teams, at least in conference play, and it's going to be a big win for somebody. Both of these teams also had fairly good draws as far as the SEC schedule, where don't have a killer slate, but having already lost out of conference, I would say these are also two teams that potentially 10-2 might not be good enough to get them into the playoff. I'm not going to go as far as say this is an elimination game. LSU still has Alabama, Texas A&M still has Texas, but very important to win this game. And so those will be fun to watch on Saturday.
Absolutely. All right, so we got our competition, 6th round of our competition. Now, believe it or not, as we pick playoff teams, and we have to live with them. So go ahead and tell us more about it.
Yeah, so hopefully at this point, most people kind of understand what we're doing, but basically each week we add a team to our kind of playoff roster. And at the very end, we will have each picked 12 teams, and whoever ends up with the most correct choices of the 12 that actually get into the playoff by the selection committee, that person will be the winner. I believe I picked first this week, George. So far, I have taken Texas, Ohio State, Alabama, which that's the only one I'm worried about at the moment, Oregon, Penn State, and you notice who's missing. This is going to be an easy one for me this week. I'm adding Georgia to that list. After they lost at Alabama, I wanted to see them get through Texas without losing a second game. They did it, so I'm adding Georgia to my list, and I don't think I need to explain why.
No, I don't think so. They back. They never really went anywhere, but they appear to be back. So as we said earlier. All right, so far I have picked Texas, Georgia, Alabama, and I feel iffy on that too, right? So Ohio State, I feel okay about that one, and Oregon, and I feel good about that one too. And then I'm not saying they're going to run the table, win the Big Ten. I'm just saying I think they're getting the playoff. I do think they could win the national title. So that leaves me with the ability here to pick Penn State, I think. I'm just going to have to join you. It's getting tougher now.
Yeah.
It's getting tougher now. I mean, at some point, you got to think about Miami. You got to think about Clemson.
Yep.
Assuming they keep winning going forward. But I'm going with Penn State for this week, and we'll see.
They've got a big one coming up. We didn't mention it in the games because it's not a rank versus rank, but Penn State is at Wisconsin. I think it's a losable game. I don't expect them to lose, but if they were to drop that one, then all of a sudden we're going to start to get a little worried about our Penn State pick, especially with Ohio State still being on that schedule for the Nittany Lions. But for now, you and I, different order, but we have the same 6 teams through 6 weeks of this.
Yeah. Hey, don't forget, if you're competing with us and you already have to have started, you can't start now. Remember to send your pick to gridirongospelpod@gmail.com by Wednesday, and we will we'll take it in there. And, after you beat us, we'll figure out what sort of reward we must give you. So, but that's our picks. And really, time for us to wrap up the first half, Brad.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get to the locker room, and we come back out for the second half. We will, as always, discuss our faith in Jesus, and we'll talk a little bit about what's on my heart this week in just a few minutes.
Welcome back to our favorite segment, the second half of Gridiron and the Gospel, the Faith in College Football podcast, because the second half is faith, where Brad and I get to talk about our shared faith in Jesus, and that's always a fun time. And our favorite segment within that is called On My Heart, where each week we share something that God is doing in our lives, something He's put on our heart, something He's impressed us with. And Brad, it's your turn this week to tell us what's on your heart.
Yeah, so this past Wednesday, we were continuing a study with the high schoolers, and it was a video series we've been watching, and it's gone through just kind of different elements of the story of the Bible. And this one was called The Rescue, and it was talking about, what Jesus has done for us. And it kind of got into the whole theme of the hero. And they were, talking to the kids about their favorite stories and the role of the hero. And self-sacrifice, and it led up to the quote from Jesus in John chapter 15, where he says, "Greater man has no love than this, to lay down his life for his friends." It all fit together very well for the point of the lesson. While I was listening to it, it made me think just kind of a step further. And I told the guys, I said, that when you become fathers, and you it's going to be something that to you is instinctive. Like, if there's ever a time when your children are in danger, the thought of putting your life on the line for them, it's not going to be something that you would even delay doing. I mean, I think I can say that safely for the vast majority of people. That type of love is one that just comes naturally, and there is a self-sacrifice that is a part of that. Is that because of that love, you would give up your life for their life. And I said that is not only what Jesus did for us, but it goes a step further, which is that Jesus didn't just give up his life for his friends. He also gave up his life for his enemies. And I don't think that there's any place that says it better than Romans chapter 5. And if you start with verse 6, it says, "For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more now that we are reconciled shall we be saved by his life. More than that, we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation." And it's just such a powerful thing to me to think about the idea of dying for your enemies. And I think about Jesus and all of the miracles he performed, and the teaching and everything that he did around the Jewish people. And then at the very end, there's a big crowd standing out there while he's on trial. And some of them may have been among the people that had been among the crowds that had been following him earlier. And they're shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." On the cross, he has people watching that are mocking him. And, when he says, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do." And it's just the idea that Jesus didn't just die for people like his disciples who believed in him and followed him, but that he died for all of the people who were against him. And that includes every one of us that came afterward, that have spent times in our lives where we have resisted and by our actions have disrespected what Jesus did for us. And yet he still died for every one of us. And just to me, George, like, that is just so powerful. I mean, it's one thing, like I said, just to be able to grasp this concept of giving up your life for someone you love. But I know I cannot conceive of giving up my life for someone who is treating me in kind of the opposite of a loving way. And yet that's the gospel. And that's what it's all about, which is that Jesus did this for every single one of us, regardless of what we think of him, and that he's given us the opportunity to be saved through his action. I thank God for that sacrifice, and the fact that I have a chance to be saved because of it, and that every one of us, everyone listening, and that we all have that same opportunity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that. It's interesting. I'm not much for Twitter or X bios, but Romans 5:8 has been something I've had in my Twitter or X bio forever, which you read that obviously. But God proves his own love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, right? Even a good man, some might dare to die, right? A good person. But God did it while we were still sinners. The Bible says in other places, we were his enemies, right? He loves us so much, but we didn't love him. We were actively his enemies. And if you don't know him, that's the status that you find yourself in. But he loves you so much that he sent Jesus to die for you. 1 Peter 1 says, we're purchased. If you've come to know him, you're purchased with his precious blood, redeemed, ransomed by his precious blood, right? That was spilled on the cross, like a spotless lamb, like a lamb without blemish or defect. And man, I just love that. We read from Titus 3 today. And as you were thinking about, just in brief, as we're still in First Peter in church, but just in brief, I flipped over to Titus 3, and as it relates to what you just said from Romans 5, it talks about, for we too were once foolish, disobedient, deceived, enslaved by various passions and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful, detesting one another, and frankly, detesting God. Verse 4 of Titus 3, but when the kindness of God our Savior and his love for mankind appeared, he saved us, not by works of righteousness we've done, but according to his mercy. Man, I love that. You can't hear, first of all, if you guys have heard the gospel 10,000 times and you've come to know Jesus and you have a relationship with him, you can't hear it enough because that salvation is magnificent. It's unbelievable, death to life. And if you haven't come to know him, man, you are in death and you need life. And Jesus offers it to you. And he died for you while you were still sinners, while you are still a sinner, because he loves you so much. So I'm so glad that you highlighted that, Brad. Such a tremendous reminder, a needed reminder that we need. So I'm glad that's on your heart tonight. I'm glad that you're teaching those kids those things. Great stuff. So
I enjoy doing it, man. I've told you that before, and it's been such a blessing to me. And I just encourage anyone out there who has just been kind of toying with the idea of getting involved somehow, but you've been reluctant to do it. Invest in kids. You know, like that's an easy place to start, especially younger kids. If you wanted to start off with like even middle school. Some people can be very intimidated by, okay, you know what, like if I'm going to be a teacher, I've got to know a lot. Well, you know what, depending on what age, you might not have to know as much as you think you do. And there are many ways to serve. You don't even have to teach. You can lead without teaching, but it's so rewarding to get involved. And I don't know about other churches, but I know that I've been in a few churches where young kids are dedicated, you know, at an early age, are dedicated by their parents. And there is involving the whole congregation, there's kind of an oath that's basically taken where everybody just kind of pledges that they will be a part of helping to raise these kids in a godly way as members of the church, you know, the church as a body, that we will all be responsible for these kids. And for any of you who have been a part of something like that, like this is one way that you can get involved in upholding your end of that deal. And there are a lot of other ways you can too. But like I said, I would just encourage anyone who has thought about it and maybe just hasn't quite gotten there yet, you know, go ask whoever leads the student ministry and just find out if there's a way that you can get started, because it just watching kids grow and mature in Christ is just an incredible thing.
absolutely. And look, if you want to reach out to us and talk about faith, or if any of this has sort of prompted something in you, you can catch us at just email us at gridirongospelpod@gmail.com. We would love to discuss our faith in Christ and your potential faith in Christ a whole lot more, even than we love to talk about college football. Or you can reach out to us, either one of us, on Twitter at George Schroeder or at Brad Edwards. You can also reach out or find us on Twitter at gridiron_gospel, and we'll get back to you too. But we'd love to talk about that for sure. So, but Brad, we got to wrap this thing up today.
Yeah. And so, you know, you've mentioned that people can reach out to us on Twitter and also that email. If you are interested in pursuing any type of partnership with us, you know, whether that's something with some type of show, business, ministry at your church, whatever you have going on, we'd love to discuss it if you're interested. If you've got people who are fans of college football, we'd love to talk to you about that. And you could reach out by that same email address, and also be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app. We're on all the major podcasting platforms. Just search for Gridiron and the Gospel or follow the links on the show website.
Absolutely. You can also search for us and find us on YouTube if you're just listening to us, right? Search for Gridiron and the Gospel. You'll find us, and you can subscribe to that page, and then sadly you'll see what we look like, which probably wouldn't be great, but go for there. So, but listen, just glad to have you guys, and I pray that you guys will tune in next week. Have a great week, and tune in next week for more Gridiron and the Gospel, a Faith in College Football podcast.